So I'm a pretty big Courtland Sutton fan for 2022 and even highlighted him as a player to buy in a recent trade show video from last week. But I was scrolling through YouTube and saw this video from an amazing fantasy analyst, Ron Stewart, giving his argument to avoid Sutton in 2022. So I watched the video, I disagreed pretty heavily, and decided to make this video reacting and countering to Ron's arguments, with his permission, of course, because he's a great guy, an amazing analyst, and you guys should go follow him and subscribe to his channel right after watching this video.
And here's the issue with Courtland Sutton. It's that in year 2 in 2019, he had his breakout year, right, where he had 72 catches, 1,112 yards, 6 touchdowns on a 26.1% target share, which was 7th in the NFL. He was the wide receiver 27 in points per game. For a year 2 player, that's really, really strong. Again, that target share number is strong. 26.1% of the targets is like an alpha wide receiver type number. Now, here's the issue that I have with Sutton. His breakout season, the season that we kind of cling on to in year 2, he didn't crack the top 24, which means on a 26.1% target share, he wasn't efficient. Now, to be fair, his quarterback play was awful. He had like Drew Lock that year, maybe even like Joe Flacco that year.
To be fair, his quarterbacks that year were Joe Flacco for half the year, then Brandon Allen for 4 games, and then he sucked, and then he got replaced by a rookie Drew Lock for 5 games to end the year. That trio threw for only 3,400 yards and 16 touchdowns all season. That's it. For him to produce as a top 30 wide receiver in points per game and top 20 actually in total fantasy points on the season, I think is actually a testament to how good Courtland Sutton was. And he did that on 125 targets. It's not like he was some insane raw target monster that season in the 140s, 150s. He was only at 125 targets because his team only threw 500 times. And again, 500 times from Joe Flacco, Brandon Allen, and Drew Lock. Plus, before Lock took over in week 13, Sutton was averaging 14.5 fantasy points per game with Flacco and Allen, and then over 15 points per game with just Joe Flacco. Then Lock came in and wrecked Sutton's end of season with 4 games under 10 fantasy points, and that's why his average went down with Drew Lock. Honestly, Seattle, I feel so bad for you with Drew Lock as your starter. I'm so sorry.
But he wasn't efficient. He's not going to be a yak guy. He's not going to be a yards per out run guy.
Actually, I realize I'm going to sound like Oscar Martinez. It's an entire video.
Because he will insert himself into just about any conversation to add facts or correct grammar.
In 2019, Sutton was 12th among wide receivers in yards after catch per reception. That was higher than Stephon Diggs, higher than Kenny Golladay, Devontae Adams, DJ Moore, a whole bunch of other guys. And then also, according to Pro Football Reference, Sutton had 12 broken tackles that season, which was only behind Austin Eckler and Christian McCaffrey in the entire league on receptions. And both backs actually had way more receptions than what Courtland Sutton did. So fun fact for you there.
Only having a 55th percentile win rate against man and a 63rd percentile win rate versus press. Again, this is his 2019 reception perception from that breakout year. That's pretty average stuff. I looked at this past year and I looked at guys who were in that, right? So he was 68.5% success rate against man, 69.1% success rate against zone or against press. Guys who were in that same range this year, like 67 to like 70-ish% success rate versus press and man. You have Russell Gage, Van Jefferson, Nico Collins.
Also, Jalen Waddle, Hunter Renfrow, and even his own teammate, Jerry Jeudy, by the way, were part of that cohort too.
Teddy Bridgewater wasn't awful. Teddy Bridgewater played with Carolina the year before. He supported Robbie Anderson, who's a deep threat, though that season he was used more intermediately, and DJ Moore was used as a deep threat, but he supported DJ Moore just fine. I have a tough time using the argument that Teddy Bridgewater can't support a deep threat type wide receiver and that Russell Wilson's going to come in and just immediately unlock him in that role. Because when we look at a guy who, again, his calling card is commanding targets downfield. Last year, his splits with and without Jeudy were absolutely insane. The minute Jeudy came back from injury, he just completely stole Sutton's lunch money. In 10 games with Jeudy, Sutton had 4 points per game on a 2 catches, 20-yard type weekly stat line. Without him, he shot up to 15.9 points per game, 6 catches, 83 yards was about his weekly averages. I don't know how Russell Wilson coming into town is going to save Sutton from being completely outspoken for by Jerry Jeudy.
So there's the meat and potatoes of this argument. What happened last year, and how does Russell Wilson change things moving forward in 2022 and beyond? So let's start with last year. because I have no idea how to explain his splits with and without Jerry Jeudy. Honestly, it is atrocious. It's really disgusting to look at. The only thing that I can even think of to try to explain it is that Bridgewater just preferred Jeudy. And honestly, Jeudy is probably the better fitting receiver for a quarterback like Teddy Bridgewater. But let's not act like Jerry Jeudy was setting the world on fire at Courtland Sutton's expense. When Jeudy returned in week 8 Sutton averaged 4 targets, 2 receptions, and 24 yards per game, never scored a touchdown. Jeudy, over that same stretch, averaged 5.4 targets, 3.5 receptions, 44 yards per game, and also never scored a touchdown. Explanation: Bridgewater and Locke are not good quarterbacks. As for the Carolina argument for Bridgewater in 2020, supporting both Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore for fantasy, those two were essentially his only 2 targets. Curtis Samuel was the only other receiver that season with over 70 targets, and then Mike Davis was the only other one on the team above 31 targets. You weren't happy with DJ Moore or Robbie Anderson that year at all, so the offense was almost entirely funneled through a couple players in Carolina, versus looking at Denver last year. Bridgewater had Sutton, Jeudy, Noah Fant, the duo of Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon, and even Alberto Quebunam had more targets last year than the starting tight end Ian Thomas did in Carolina. So Carolina had 4 players that got over 35 targets in 2020. Denver last year had 7. Now that leads us to the Russell Wilson argument and what changes now for the Broncos offense, and specifically for Courtland Sutton. For one, Russell Wilson isn't even on the same planet of talent as Bridgewater, Locke, Flacco, all those quarterbacks that Sutton has played with already in his career. Sutton has never been on a Broncos team that has thrown for more than 20 touchdowns in a single season. Wilson has never thrown under 20 touchdowns ever in his career. Sutton has never been on a Broncos team that has thrown for more than 20 touchdowns in a single season. Wilson has never thrown under 20 touchdowns ever in his career. Even in his down year last year, he still threw 25 touchdowns. We also know that Wilson has been incredibly efficient his entire career. I mean, how else do you consistently throw for over 30 touchdowns on the Seahawks if you're not efficient? He's very accurate with a career 65% completion percentage and 8.2 adjusted yards per attempt. 2 things, again, that Sutton has never had in a quarterback. So overall, saying that Russell Wilson is going to take this Broncos offense to a new level, I feel like is still somewhat of an understatement, and Courtland Sutton is going to greatly benefit from an actually good quarterback on his team.
All of this is through the perspective of at cost, right? It's not that Courtland Sutton's a bad player. It is that his price is outrageous at this point. He is going in the early 4th around pick 38. So that is like the 402. You're thinking about the 402, and I just can't pay that price. He is going at the wide receiver 18. He has not finished as a top 24 receiver yet. And I would prefer Jeudy over him in that same offense. I would prefer everybody on this list. I would prefer Deontay. I would prefer McLaurin. I would prefer Metcalf, Allen Robinson. Everybody on this list I would prefer over Sutton.
Okay, so he's speaking in terms of redraft and specifically best ball price, which I am surprised Sutton is that high on Underdog, actually. I do disagree, though, on taking Metcalf, McLaurin, and probably also A-Rob over him for 2022, but those are different video arguments for a later time. One of the reasons why Sutton is a great buy to me in Dynasty is because his Dynasty price is actually wide receiver 34 from May DLF ADP, so pretty significantly cheaper than his redraft price. Of course, in Dynasty, we care about different things other than just the season right ahead of us, but Sutton is still relatively young. He's 26 and a half years old, and what we expect to be a great offense now with Russell Wilson, who is a much better quarterback than a lot of the receivers above Sutton currently have. And honestly, like the mass consensus on Underdog believes, he will outperform that wide receiver 34 ADP in 2022, meaning his Dynasty value should rise from now until this time next year. What I would love to do is tier down from a Dynasty wide receiver 2 like a Deontay Johnson or a Terry McLaurin or Amari Cooper to Courtland Sutton, and then get a little something extra on top, or tearing down from a running back to another running back, and then you add Courtland Sutton to your roster to make up that value difference. Or if you have that late first in your rookie draft still and you guys haven't drafted and you don't want to decide between Christian Watson, Jahan Dotson, or George Pickens, just trade it for Courtland Sutton. But before you make any offers for Courtland Sutton, why don't you just click this video right up here and let Justin tell you about a running back that he and I both love to buy right now in Dynasty.